black girl is wrongfully arrested for robbery, her life shattered in an instant. But there's one thing the cops didn't know. Her father holds a powerful position they never saw coming. What will he do when he finds out what they've done to his daughter? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Maya's heart soared as she walked down the bustling city sidewalk, the boutique's signature cream-colored shopping bag swinging gently from her arm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the tall buildings, and a gentle spring breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming cherry blossoms from the nearby park. She couldn't help but smile, remembering how the emerald dress had caught her eye the moment she'd stepped into the store. The color reminded her of the pendant her mother had given her for her 16th birthday. Maya had worked extra hours at her campus library job for months to afford this special purchase, and the feeling of accomplishment made the dress even more precious. The sales associate had been wonderfully helpful, bringing her different sizes and suggesting accessories that would complement the dress perfectly. When Maya had emerged from the fitting room and seen herself in the three-way mirror, she knew it was meant to be. The way the silk chiffon draped elegantly from her shoulders and the subtle beading caught the light made her feel like royalty. As she waited at the crosswalk, Maya's fingers traced the embossed logo on the shopping bag. Her graduation was just 3 weeks away and everything was falling into place. 4 years of hard work, countless late-night study sessions, and determination were about to pay off. She'd already accepted a position at a prestigious marketing firm, and this dress would be the perfect statement piece for both her graduation ceremony and the celebration dinner her parents had planned. The crosswalk signal changed to green, and Maya stepped off the curb with the crowd of other pedestrians. She could picture her mother's face when she showed her the dress. Elaine Johnson had always encouraged Maya's sense of style, teaching her that presenting yourself well was a form of self-respect. The sidewalks were getting busier as the workday came to an end. Maya carefully navigated through the growing crowd, protecting her precious package from bumping shoulders and swinging briefcases. She passed her favorite coffee shop, where the rich aroma of freshly ground beans wafted through the open door, mixing with the sweet smell of baked goods. Maya checked her phone again, noting that she had plenty of time to make it home before dinner. Her father, despite his busy schedule as a judge, always made it a point to be home for family meals. It was a tradition that had kept them close throughout her college years, even when her course load had been at its heaviest. The thought of her father brought a wider smile to her face. Judge Thomas Johnson had always been her biggest supporter, from helping her with middle school science projects to advising her on college applications. His wisdom and guidance had shaped her into the confident young woman she was today. As she turned onto a quieter street, Maya began mentally planning how she would present the dress to her parents. She imagined hanging it carefully in her room, making sure the lighting was perfect before calling them in for the big reveal. Her mother would probably cry. She always did at meaningful moments like these, and her father would beam with that proud smile she knew so well. The shopping bag felt light in her hands, but Maya knew it carried so much more than just a dress. It represented her achievement, her transition from student to professional, and the beginning of an exciting new chapter in her life. Each step brought her closer to home, and her heart felt full with anticipation and joy. The familiar sights of her neighborhood came into view. The old oak tree with its spreading branches, the quaint houses with their well-tended gardens, and the friendly faces of neighbors who had watched her grow up. Maya took a deep breath of the fresh spring air, feeling truly content in this perfect moment. Maya's heart skipped a beat as she noticed the police officer approaching her. His badge gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, but there was nothing warm about his demeanor. Officer Mark Reynolds moved with deliberate steps, his stern expression fixed on the cream-colored shopping bag she carried. "Excuse me, miss," Officer Reynolds said, his voice carrying an edge that made Maya's shoulders tense. His eyes lingered on the boutique's distinctive logo. "That dress looks quite expensive. Can you provide proof of purchase?" The question caught Maya off guard. She'd been lost in happy thoughts just moments ago, and now she felt herself being pulled into an unexpected confrontation. Still, she maintained her composure, just as her father had always taught her to do in challenging situations. "Of course, officer," Maya replied, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden flutter of anxiety in her chest. "I have the receipt right here." She reached toward the shopping bag, where she had carefully tucked the receipt into the small envelope provided by the boutique. Before her fingers could grasp the paper, Officer Reynolds cut her off. "You know, it's not common for someone like you to shop at this boutique." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and Maya felt as though the temperature around her had dropped several degrees. The knot in her stomach tightened as she processed his words. The joy she'd felt just minutes ago about her purchase evaporated, replaced by a cold understanding of what was really happening. Maya drew upon her inner strength, remembering all the discussions she'd had with her father about maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice. "I'm not sure what you mean, but I assure you I purchased this dress legitimately," she said, her voice calm despite the trembling she felt inside. She tried to meet his gaze directly, hoping to convey both her innocence and her resolve. "We'll need to verify that down at the station," Officer Reynolds declared, dismissing her words entirely. He reached out and placed his hand on her arm, his grip firm and uncomfortable. The touch made Maya's skin crawl, but she fought the urge to pull away, knowing it could make the situation worse. Looking around, Maya noticed several passers-by slowing down to watch the scene unfold. Some averted their eyes while others stared openly. The scrutiny made her cheeks burn with humiliation, though she knew she'd done nothing wrong. "Is that really necessary?" Maya asked, struggling to keep the tremor out of her voice. "You can check with the store manager." She gestured back toward the boutique, which was still visible from where they stood. It seemed like a reasonable solution, one that could resolve the situation quickly and professionally. But Officer Reynolds appeared uninterested in reasonable solutions. Ignoring her suggestion completely, he began steering her toward his patrol car parked at the curb. His hand remained firmly on her arm, guiding her with an authority that brooked no argument. Maya felt her throat tighten as the reality of the situation settled over her. The beautiful spring day that had held so much promise was transforming into something entirely different, something ugly and unjust. The shopping bag that had felt so light with joy just minutes ago now seemed to weigh heavily in her hand as Officer Reynolds led her toward his vehicle. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the small interrogation room, casting harsh shadows across the metal table where Maya sat. The room felt cold and sterile, with its blank walls and single mirror that she knew others could see through. Her designer shopping bag sat on the table like evidence in a crime she hadn't committed. Maya's hands rested in her lap, and though they trembled slightly, she kept her posture straight and dignified. The lessons her parents had taught her about maintaining composure in difficult situations echoed in her mind. She watched as Officer Reynolds paced near the door, his presence both intimidating and infuriating. Taking a deep breath that filled her lungs with the stale air, Maya lifted her chin and spoke with quiet determination. "I have the right to contact my attorney." The words came out clearer and stronger than she'd expected, given how her heart was racing. Officer Reynolds turned to face her, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The expression made Maya's stomach churn, but she held his gaze steadily. After what felt like an eternity, He pulled out his cell phone and placed it on the table in front of her with a dismissive gesture. Maya's fingers shook slightly as she picked up the phone. She dialed her father's number, each digit pressed with deliberate care. The phone rang twice before his familiar voice answered, bringing a wave of relief washing over her. "Dad," she said, her voice quieter now, heavy with emotion she was trying to contain. "I'm at the police station. An officer detained me, accusing me of stealing the dress I bought." The words tumbled out quickly, as if speaking faster would somehow make the situation end sooner. She heard her father's sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. His voice was controlled, but carried an undertone of concern that only she would recognize. "Are you okay? Did he give you his name?" Maya glanced at Officer Reynolds, who stood watching her with his arms crossed. "Yes, his name is Officer Mark Reynolds," she answered. She paused, swallowing hard before adding, "He also treated me inappropriately." The admission made her voice waver slightly, and she noticed Officer Reynolds shift his stance. Her father's voice came through clear and steady, an anchor in this storm. "Stay calm, Maya. I'll handle this." There was a brief pause before he added firmly, "Do not mention that I'm your father or that I'm a judge." The call ended, and Maya placed the phone back on the table, careful to keep her movements measured and calm, despite the turmoil she felt inside. The weight of her father's words settled over her as she sat back in the uncomfortable metal chair, aware of Officer Reynolds' scrutinizing gaze, but refusing to let it intimidate her further. Judge Johnson's fingers moved swiftly across his phone screen as he stepped away from the courthouse bench where he'd been presiding. His chambers offered privacy as he dialed attorney Lisa Mitchell's number, his trusted colleague of 15 years. The wood-paneled room seemed to close in around him as he waited for her to answer, his free hand gripping the edge of his mahogany desk. "Lisa Mitchell speaking," came the crisp, professional voice on the other end. "Lisa, it's Thomas," he said, his voice steady despite the worry churning inside him. "I need your help with an urgent matter." "Of course, Thomas. What's going on?" Lisa's tone shifted, recognizing the gravity in his voice. Judge Johnson took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "My daughter Maya has been detained at the 5th Precinct. An officer named Reynolds has accused her of theft, despite her having proof of purchase. She's also indicated that his behavior was inappropriate during the arrest." Lisa's sharp intake of breath carried through the phone. "That's completely unacceptable. Do you want me to represent her?" "Yes, please. I need you to go to the precinct and represent my daughter. Make sure she's released promptly." His fingers drummed against the desk surface. "And Lisa, she's following my instructions not to reveal our relationship. I think it's better if we handle this situation carefully." "I understand completely, Thomas. I'll head there right away," Lisa assured him. "I'll treat this with the utmost discretion." As Lisa gathered her belongings and headed to her car, Maya sat in the interrogation room, her mind focused on staying calm. The emerald dress in its boutique bag remained untouched on the table, a silent witness to this ordeal. She kept her breathing steady, just as her mother had taught her during stressful moments. The minutes ticked by slowly on the wall clock, each second marked by a faint click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Maya's thoughts drifted to her father's words, understanding the wisdom behind keeping his identity secret. As a judge's daughter, she had grown up learning about justice and the proper way to handle difficult situations. Now, those lessons were being put to the test. Officer Reynolds had left her alone in the room, but she could hear muffled voices and footsteps in the hallway outside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glow across the metal table. Maya's fingers absently traced the smooth surface of her chair's armrest, focusing on the cool metal beneath her fingertips to ground herself in the moment. She thought about her graduation ceremony, now just weeks away. The emerald dress was supposed to be a symbol of celebration, of achievement. Instead, it had become the center of this unsettling encounter. But Maya held on to her composure, knowing that staying calm and following her father's guidance was the best course of action. The sound of clicking heels in the hallway caught her attention, growing louder as they approached the interrogation room. Maya straightened in her chair, maintaining the dignified posture her mother had always emphasized. She knew help was coming, and she just needed to remain patient and composed until it arrived. The police station's glass doors swung open as attorney Lisa Mitchell strode in, her heels clicking purposefully against the polished floor. Her navy blue suit and confident demeanor commanded attention as she approached the front desk, her leather briefcase held firmly in her right hand. "I'm attorney Lisa Mitchell, here to represent Maya Johnson," she announced, presenting her credentials with practiced efficiency. The desk sergeant examined her documentation and made a quick call. Minutes later, Officer Reynolds appeared, his earlier smugness somewhat diminished by the presence of legal counsel. Lisa's eyes narrowed as she assessed him, noting his defensive posture. "Officer Reynolds," she began, her voice carrying the weight of years of legal experience, "I understand you're holding my client without probable cause. I've reviewed the situation, and there is no evidence to hold her, and any further detention will be unlawful." Her words were measured but firm, leaving no room for argument. Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Lisa and the paperwork in front of him. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his face as he considered his options. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Your client is free to go," he said curtly, pushing a form across the desk for Maya to sign. Maya emerged from the holding area, still carrying her boutique bag with the emerald dress inside. Her relief was visible, though she maintained her composure as she signed the release papers. The designer bag that had drawn such unwarranted suspicion earlier now served as a silent reminder of the afternoon's events. As they walked through the station's corridors, Maya turned to Lisa. "I'm grateful for your help," she said softly, her voice carrying genuine appreciation. The attorney's presence had transformed what could have been a prolonged ordeal into a resolved situation. "Just doing my job," Lisa replied with a reassuring smile, her professional demeanor warming slightly. She guided Maya through the station's exit and into the early evening air, where her black sedan waited in the parking lot. The drive to Maya's house was quiet, with the city streets passing by in a blur of street lights and shop windows. Maya watched the familiar neighborhoods roll past, feeling the tension gradually leave her shoulders. The boutique bag rested in her lap, its contents still pristine despite the day's events. When they pulled up to Maya's house, the porch light was already on, casting a warm glow across the front steps. Lisa brought the car to a smooth stop, and Maya gathered her belongings. "Thank you again," Maya said as she stepped out of the car, clutching the boutique bag close. Lisa nodded in acknowledgement, watching as Maya walked up the path to her front door. As Maya approached the entrance to her home, a profound sense of relief washed over her. The familiar sight of her mother's carefully tended flower beds and the warm glow from inside the house provided a comforting contrast to the sterile police station she'd left behind. Maya stepped into her family's warm, welcoming home, the familiar scent of her mother's lavender candles washing over her. Elaine Johnson rushed from the kitchen, her face a mixture of worry and relief, her hands twisting the dish towel she was holding. "Oh, Maya, are you all right?" Elaine asked, immediately pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. The comfort of her mother's arms made Maya's carefully maintained composure begin to crack. "I'm okay, Mom," Maya replied, her her voice quivering slightly as the emotions of the day finally started to surface. She clutched the boutique bag closer, as if it were both a shield and a reminder of the ordeal she'd endured. Judge Johnson emerged from his study, his usual commanding presence softened by concern for his daughter. He joined his wife and daughter, wrapping his strong arms around them both in a protective embrace that spoke volumes about his love for his family. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said softly, his deep voice carrying notes of both anger and tenderness. The family stood together for a moment, drawing strength from their closeness. They moved to the living room, settling onto the comfortable leather couch where they'd shared so many family moments. The warm lighting from the table lamps cast a gentle glow across the room, but Maya's initial relief began to give way to frustration as questions bubbled to the surface. She turned to her father, her brow furrowed. "Why didn't you come to the station yourself?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotion. Maya watched as her father leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression thoughtful. Judge Johnson took a deep breath before responding, his years of judicial experience evident in his measured tone. "I have a plan to address this properly. Trust me," he assured her, reaching out to pat her hand. "That officer has had several complaints filed against him, and it's time he's held accountable." Maya studied her father's face, seeing the determination in his eyes. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a glimmer of hope, knowing her father would handle the situation with the wisdom and justice he was known for. "All right, Dad, I trust you," she said, her shoulders dropping slightly as the tension began to leave her body. The events of the day had taken their toll, and the emotional weight felt almost physical now. Maya stood up slowly, still holding the boutique bag that contained what should have been just a happy reminder of her upcoming graduation. "I think I need to rest for a while," she said quietly. She made her way upstairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The emotional toll of the day weighed on her like a thick blanket, making even the familiar journey to her room feel like a momentous task. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Judge Johnson sat at the breakfast table, his coffee growing cold beside him. His usually pristine suit felt like armor today. He'd chosen it deliberately, though he wasn't heading to court. Elaine moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, but her movements were slower than usual, weighted down by worry. She placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her husband, though she knew he probably wouldn't eat much. "I'll be out for a while," Judge Johnson said, his voice steady but serious. "Please keep an eye on Maya." He glanced toward the stairs, where their daughter's room remained quiet. After yesterday's ordeal, Maya had fallen into an exhausted sleep early the previous evening. "Of course," Elaine replied, concern evident in her eyes as she reached across the table to squeeze her husband's hand. She understood the gravity of what he was about to do. Do what needs to be done. The drive to the police station felt longer than usual. Judge Johnson's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he rehearsed what he would say, ensuring his emotions wouldn't overshadow his purpose. The familiar brick building came into view, and he parked his car in the visitor's lot, taking a moment to center himself before stepping out. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floors. The air smelled of coffee and paper, familiar scents from his years in the justice system. Judge Johnson approached the front desk with measured steps, his presence commanding yet understated. Officer Reynolds sat behind the desk, slouched in his chair and scrolling through something on his computer. He barely looked up as Judge Johnson approached, his dismissive attitude apparent in every movement. "What seems to be the problem?" Officer Reynolds asked reluctantly, his tone suggesting this was an unwelcome interruption to his morning. "I'd like to report an incident of misconduct by one of your officers," Judge Johnson stated calmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority he developed over years on the bench. He stood straight, his expression neutral but resolute. Officer Reynolds sighed heavily, clearly annoyed by the request. He reached for a stack of forms, pulling them out with obvious reluctance. "Fine, take a seat," he said, sliding the paperwork across the desk. His casual disregard for the complaint process was evident in every movement. Judge Johnson accepted the forms without reaction, though internally he noted every detail of the officer's unprofessional behavior. Officer Reynolds remained oblivious to the fact that he was speaking to a respected judge, the same judge whose daughter he had wrongfully detained just yesterday. Officer Reynolds' pen scratched against the paper as he mechanically took notes, his posture reflecting years of routine complaint processing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the forms spread across the desk. The familiar smell of stale coffee and printer ink hung in the air, a constant reminder of countless hours spent in this same position. "And when did this occur?" he asked in a bored tone, not bothering to look up from his paperwork. His voice carried the weariness of someone who had heard countless complaints before, his fingers drumming absently against the edge of the desk. "Yesterday evening," Judge Johnson replied, his calm demeanor masking the controlled anger beneath. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, watching Officer Reynolds' every movement with the careful attention he'd developed over decades in the courtroom. His polished shoes reflected the harsh overhead lighting, a stark contrast to the scuffed linoleum floor. As Judge Johnson began recounting the events, his voice remained steady and precise. He described how a young woman had been wrongfully detained after making a legitimate purchase, how she had been treated with suspicion and disrespect, and how an officer had placed his hands on her inappropriately. Each word was measured and deliberate, carrying the weight of years of courtroom experience. With each detail, Officer Reynolds' writing grew slower. His mechanical note-taking began to falter as the familiar scenario unfolded on paper. The confident smirk he'd worn earlier started to fade, replaced by a growing unease that crept across his features. Sweat began to bead at his hairline, and his collar suddenly felt too tight. The pen in his hand nearly stopped completely when Judge Johnson described the emerald dress, the designer boutique, and the specific time of the incident. Officer Reynolds' shoulders tensed visibly, and a slight tremor appeared in his hand. His breath caught momentarily as the details hit too close to home. Looking up sharply from his notes, his face had lost its earlier arrogance. "Who is this complaint against?" he demanded, his voice carrying a hint of defensiveness mixed with dawning realization. The chair creaked beneath him as he shifted uncomfortably. Judge Johnson met his gaze steadily, his expression remaining neutral but authoritative. "Officer Mark Reynolds," he stated evenly, each word clear and deliberate. The statement hung in the air like a heavy curtain dropping. The color drained from Officer Reynolds' face as recognition hit him. His eyes widened slightly and his jaw tightened. The pen in his hand trembled noticeably now as the full impact of the situation began to sink in. A flicker of apprehension crossed his features as he realized he was face to face with someone who wasn't just another civilian filing a routine complaint. His throat worked as he tried to swallow past the sudden dryness. The air in the station seemed to grow thicker, the ambient noise of ringing phones and distant conversations fading into the background. Officer Reynolds sat frozen in his chair, the complaint formed before him now taking on an entirely different significance. The fluorescent light continued its relentless buzz overhead, a soundtrack to his mounting discomfort. Officer Reynolds' fingers tightened around the pen as he struggled to maintain his professional facade. The morning sunlight streaming through the station's windows cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. His earlier confidence had crumbled, replaced by a defensive posture that spoke volumes about his inner turmoil. "You have no proof or witnesses," he scoffed, attempting to inject authority back into his voice. "It's your word against mine." The words came out sharp and brittle, like shards of broken glass. His hand moved to his belt, an unconscious gesture of authority that had become second nature over his years on the force. Judge Johnson remained perfectly still, his expression unchanging. The weight of his experience in the courtroom filled the space between them, making the small office feel even more cramped. His tailored suit and commanding presence created a stark contrast to Officer Reynolds' increasingly disheveled appearance. "I'm aware of the evidence required in such cases," Judge Johnson replied, his tone measured and precise. Each word carried the weight of decades spent presiding over similar situations, though he kept this knowledge carefully concealed. The morning light caught his silver hair, lending him an almost ethereal authority. Frustration rolled off Officer Reynolds in visible waves. His chair scraped harshly against the floor as he pushed back from the desk and stood up, his movements sharp and aggressive. The coffee cup on his desk rattled slightly from the force of his motion, leaving small brown rings on the scattered papers below. "This conversation is over," he announced, gesturing dismissively toward the door. Sweat had begun to darken the collar of his uniform, betraying his attempt at appearing unaffected. "You can see yourself out." His voice carried a forced bravado that echoed hollowly in the small space. Judge Johnson rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. He straightened his tie with practiced ease, maintaining eye contact with the increasingly agitated officer. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across both men's faces as they stood facing each other across the desk. "Very well," he stated, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had become second nature after years on the bench. "You will be hearing from my attorney soon." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Without another word, Judge Johnson turned and walked toward the exit. His footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor, each step measured and purposeful. The morning sunlight caught him as he reached the door, illuminating his silhouette for a moment before he stepped out into the hallway, leaving Officer Reynolds standing alone in his office, the complaint form still lying unfinished on his desk. Officer Reynolds leaned back in his creaking desk chair, a smirk playing across his face as he replayed the morning's confrontation in his mind. The afternoon sun filtered through the dusty blinds of the precinct, casting striped shadows across his cluttered desk. He absently shuffled through a stack of paperwork, dismissing the earlier interaction as just another civilian complaint that would amount to nothing. The clock on the wall ticked steadily as he went about his routine, processing minor infractions and filling out reports. A sharp knock at his door interrupted his work. "Officer Reynolds," the desk sergeant called out, holding an official-looking envelope. "This just came for you. Needs immediate attention." Mark snatched the envelope, his confidence wavering slightly as he noted the court seal. As he read the contents, his face darkened. The formal language jumped out at him. "Lawsuit, misconduct, harassment, summons to appear." His hands began to shake, not from fear but from anger. The paper crinkled loudly as his fingers tightened around it. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, crumpling the summons into a tight ball and hurling it toward the trash can. It bounced off the rim and rolled under his desk, much like his attempt to dismiss its significance. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of irritation and defensive thoughts. Later that evening, Mark unlocked the door to his apartment, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. The space that greeted him was sparse and unwelcoming. Bare walls where family photos once hung, empty spaces on shelves where Emily's books used to be. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic. He moved through the dimly lit rooms, not bothering to turn on more lights than necessary. The kitchen counter held a collection of unwashed coffee mugs and takeout containers, evidence of his solitary existence since Emily left. Her absence was a constant reminder of his failures, though he refused to acknowledge them as such. Dropping onto his worn leather couch, Mark kicked off his boots and loosened his tie. The television remained dark, its blank screen reflecting his slouched figure. His eyes drifted to the empty spot beside him, where Emily used to sit, reading her novels or sharing stories about her day. The memory of her last night here surfaced unbidden. Her tears, his raised voice, the sound of the door slamming. He pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on tomorrow's court appearance. "They've got nothing," he reassured himself, his voice sounding hollow in the empty room. "Just another entitled kid making accusations." The words felt rehearsed, even to his own ears. The bedroom was equally unwelcoming, with its unmade bed and clothes scattered across the floor. Mark didn't bother changing out of his uniform pants and undershirt before lying down. The streetlight outside cast an orange glow through the thin curtains, creating shadows that danced across the ceiling. Despite his outward confidence, sleep proved elusive. He tossed and turned, his mind cycling through various scenarios for tomorrow's hearing. But each time doubt crept in, he pushed it away with practiced ease. "The judge will see right through this," he mumbled into his pillow. "Just like all the other complaints." Finally, exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted off to sleep, clinging to his certainty that tomorrow would be nothing more than an inconvenience. The summons lay forgotten and crumpled under his desk at the precinct, but its implications would follow him into an uneasy sleep. The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Officer Reynolds strode through the heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 3, his boots clicking against the floor with each confident step. His pressed uniform and straight posture projected an image of authority, masking any lingering doubts from the previous night. The courtroom was already filling with the usual morning bustle, attorneys shuffling papers, clerks organizing files, and a few spectators settling into the wooden benches. Reynolds took his seat at the defendant's table, nodding curtly to his department-assigned attorney, who looked unusually tense. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed through the chamber. The rustle of movement filled the air as everyone stood. Reynolds maintained his practiced expression of indifference, expecting another routine hearing. The side door opened and the judge entered, his black robes flowing behind him. "The Honorable Judge Thomas Johnson presiding," the bailiff announced. Reynolds' confident facade crumpled instantly, his face drained of color as recognition hit him like a physical blow. There, ascending the bench with measured steps, was the same man he had dismissed so casually at the precinct. The man whose complaint he had treated with such disdain was now sitting in judgment over him. His throat went dry, and his collar suddenly felt too tight. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him. The previous day's interaction played back in his mind with crystal clarity. His dismissive tone, the casual way he had tried to brush off the complaint, his arrogant assumption that nothing would come of it. "You may be seated," Judge Johnson announced, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held at the precinct. The room settled, but Reynolds remained frozen for a moment before his attorney tugged at his sleeve. "Your Honor, Reynolds started, his voice cracking. The words stuck in his throat as panic clouded his thoughts. His usual commanding presence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that made his hands tremble slightly on the table before him. Judge Johnson raised his hand, the gesture both deliberate and final. "Please remain seated, Officer Reynolds. "We'll proceed according to protocol," he stated firmly. His tone was professional, betraying no hint of their previous encounter, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. Reynolds slumped back in his chair, acutely aware of every eye in the courtroom. The morning light that had seemed so bright moments ago now felt harsh and exposing. His attorney beside him shuffled papers nervously, clearly sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and began reviewing the documents before him with methodical precision. The rustle of papers seemed deafening in the tense silence. Reynolds found himself studying Judge Johnson's face, searching for any sign of the confrontation from yesterday. But the judge's expression remained impassive and professional. The reality of his situation settled over Reynolds like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just another complaint to be brushed aside, or another civilian to be intimidated. He had unknowingly revealed his true character to the very person who now held significant power over his future. His years of avoiding consequences through intimidation and dismissal had finally caught up with him in the most unexpected way. The courtroom fell silent as the large screen descended from the ceiling. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, stood with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, we'd like to present Exhibit A, security footage from Elegance Boutique on May 15th. The video began to play, its high-definition clarity leaving no room for misinterpretation. The footage showed Maya entering the store, her excitement evident in her careful selection of the emerald dress. The timestamp ticked away as she made her way to the register, paid for her purchase, and received her beautifully wrapped package. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the footage continued. The camera angle switched to the exterior of the store, capturing Maya's phone call with her father. Then came the moment that made several jurors lean forward. Officer Reynolds approaching Maya with unmistakable aggression in his stance. The footage was damning. It clearly showed Reynolds grabbing Maya's arm roughly, despite her visible compliance and attempts to show her receipt. Several gasps echoed through the courtroom as they witnessed his unnecessarily forceful handling of the situation. "As we can see," the prosecutor stated, her voice steady, "Ms. Johnson posed no threat and was fully cooperative, yet Officer Reynolds chose to escalate the situation unnecessarily." More evidence followed: photographs of bruising on Maya's arm where Reynolds had gripped her, testimony from the boutique staff confirming her purchase, and statements from other officers about Reynolds' history of similar incidents. Reynolds' shoulders sagged further with each piece of evidence. His carefully maintained facade of authority crumbled as the truth of his actions played out before him. The security footage continued to loop silently on the screen, a constant reminder of his misconduct. For the first time in his career, Reynolds felt the full weight of shame and regret. His hands trembled as he reached up to wipe away unexpected tears that had begun to fall. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the hushed courtroom. The words seemed to surprise even him, as though they had escaped without his permission. Judge Johnson sat impassively, his expression neutral as he observed the officer's breakdown. The morning light cast shadows across his face as he made a note on the paper before him. After a moment, he looked up, his voice clear and measured. "Before we conclude," Judge Johnson announced, "there's one more witness we'd like to call." The tension in the courtroom heightened as everyone waited to see who this final witness would be. Reynolds lifted his tear-stained face, wondering what more evidence could possibly be presented against him. The courtroom doors opened with a soft creak, and Emily Reynolds walked in with measured steps. Her shoulders were squared, though her hands trembled slightly as she approached the witness stand. Officer Reynolds' mouth fell open, his face draining of color as he watched his estranged wife take her position before the court. Emily's eyes never met her former husband's as she was sworn in. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her brown hair pulled back neatly, projecting an image of quiet dignity. The prosecutor approached her with gentle consideration. "Mrs. Reynolds, could you please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant?" Emily took a deep breath, her fingers interlacing in her lap. "I was married to Mark Reynolds for 8 years, she began, her voice soft but clear. During that time, I lived in constant fear of his temper and controlling behavior." The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. "Could you elaborate on that fear?" "Mark," Emily paused, swallowing hard. "Officer Reynolds would often use his position of authority to intimidate me. If I disagreed with him or tried to assert myself, he would remind me that no one would believe my word over that of a police officer." In his seat, Officer Reynolds slumped forward, his face buried in his hands. Emily's words seemed to pierce through his remaining defenses. "What led you to finally seek help?" the prosecutor asked. "I had reached my breaking point," Emily replied, her voice growing stronger. "One evening, after a particularly frightening confrontation, I found myself in Judge Johnson's courtroom for an unrelated matter. He noticed my distress and asked to speak with me privately in his chambers." She turned slightly toward Judge Johnson, gratitude evident in her expression. Judge Johnson listened without judgment. He helped me understand that I deserved better, that there were people and resources available to help me. He connected me with a domestic violence counselor and recommended legal assistance. The prosecutor approached the bench with a document. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the restraining order filed by Mrs. Reynolds 3 years ago, along with the accompanying photographs and medical records." Officer Reynolds flinched visibly at the mention of these documents, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Mrs. Reynolds," the prosecutor continued, "do you recognize the behavior Officer Reynolds displayed toward Maya Johnson?" "Yes," Emily answered firmly. "The intimidation, the abuse of power, the physical roughness, it's the same pattern I experienced throughout our marriage. He uses his badge to make others feel powerless, just as he did with me." The courtroom remained silent as Emily's testimony concluded. As she rose to leave the witness stand, her steps were lighter, as though unburdened by finally speaking her truth in public. Officer Reynolds remained hunched over, his former arrogance completely dissolved, replaced by the undeniable weight of his exposed actions. The security footage continued to play silently on the screen behind him, a stark reminder of how his treatment of Mayo had brought his past misdeeds to light. His carefully constructed image of authority lay in ruins around him, destroyed not by force, but by the quiet strength of truth spoken aloud. Judge Johnson's stern gaze fell upon Officer Reynolds, who stood trembling before the bench. The once proud officer's police uniform, which had been his shield of authority for so many years, now seemed to hang loosely on his diminished frame. "Officer Mark Reynolds," Judge Johnson began, his voice resonating through the hushed courtroom, "this court has carefully considered all evidence presented, including the security footage, witness testimonies, and the documented history of your conduct." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the air. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Officer Reynolds' face, highlighting the deep lines of worry that had formed during the trial. His hands, usually steady when wielding authority, now fidgeted nervously at his sides. "Your actions demonstrate a disturbing pattern of abuse of power and discrimination," Judge Johnson continued. "The position of law enforcement officer carries with it a sacred trust, a trust you have repeatedly violated." Maya sat in the gallery, her emerald graduation dress carefully folded in her lap. Her mother, Elaine, held her hand tightly, offering silent support as they watched the proceedings unfold. In light of the evidence and testimonies presented, you are hereby sentenced to 4 years in state prison for abuse of power, harassment, and assault. Judge Johnson's voice carried the full weight of justice as he delivered the sentence. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, causing several spectators to jump slightly in their seats. A low murmur rippled through the gallery as the significance of the moment registered with those present. 2 court officers approached Officer Reynolds, their movements practiced and professional. As they began to lead him away, his shoulders sagged visibly, the last vestiges of his former authority crumbling away. His polished shoes, once clicking confidently across these same floors, now scraped listlessly against the wooden boards. Maya watched from her seat, her breath catching slightly as a complex wave of emotions washed over her. The tension she had carried since that day outside the boutique began to dissolve, replaced by a profound sense of closure. Her father's commitment to justice had transformed her personal ordeal into a moment of accountability and change. As Officer Reynolds was led toward the courtroom doors, he turned his head, catching a final glimpse of the scene behind him. Judge Johnson had descended from the bench and was making his way to his daughter. Maya's eyes, still bearing traces of the pain from her ordeal, met Officer Reynolds' gaze briefly before he was ushered through the heavy wooden doors. The sight of father and daughter together, the judge's protective stance as he approached Maya, seemed to deliver a final, powerful message about the true meaning of justice and authority. The doors closed behind Officer Reynolds with a definitive thud, marking the end of his reign of abuse and the beginning of his punishment. The heavy metal gates of the state penitentiary clanged shut behind Mark Reynolds with a finality that made him flinch. The sprawling concrete complex loomed before him, its gray walls stretching toward a cloudy sky. Gone was his crisp police uniform, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. A stern-faced corrections officer guided him through the processing area. "Arms up," the officer commanded, performing a routine search. Mark complied mechanically, his mind still struggling to process his new reality. The fingerprinting process felt surreal. How many times had he been on the other side of this procedure? "Inmate number 2-1091, the processing officer announced, attaching an identification tag to Mark's uniform. The numbers felt like a brand, stripping away the last remnants of his former identity. His personal belongings were cataloged and stored away. His watch, his wallet, the last pieces of his life outside these walls. As they moved through the facility's corridors, Mark felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. The population here was predominantly black, a fact that now filled him with a creeping dread. Whispers followed him like shadows. "That's him! The cop who got locked up. Karma's got a way of coming full circle. Look who's wearing orange now." Mark kept his eyes fixed on the floor, but he couldn't escape the murmurs that seemed to bounce off every surface. His throat felt dry, and his hands trembled slightly as they approached his assigned cell block. "Block D," the corrections officer announced, leading him through another set of security doors. Block D's reputation preceded it, known for housing some of the facility's toughest inmates. The cell block's atmosphere was thick with tension, and Mark could feel it pressing against his skin like a physical force. The narrow walkway seemed endless as they passed cell after cell. Each step echoed off the concrete walls, announcing his presence to everyone within earshot. Some inmates pressed against their bars to get a better look, while others hung back in their cells, watching with calculated interest. "Fresh meat," someone called out, "and it's a cop." The words sparked a wave of reactions. Some inmates rattled their bars, others shouted obscenities, and a few simply stared with cold, knowing smiles. Mark's arrogance, once his shield against the world, had evaporated completely, leaving behind a raw, primal fear that churned in his stomach. His assigned cell was near the end of the block, a cramped space with bare concrete walls, a metal toilet, and a set of bunk beds. His cellmate, a muscular man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, barely glanced up from his book as Mark entered. The cell door slammed shut behind him with a metallic clang that seemed to echo through his very bones. Standing there, clutching his issued bedding, Mark felt the full weight of his situation crash down upon him. He was no longer Officer Reynolds, the authority figure who could intimidate and control others with impunity. Here, he was just another inmate, stripped of power and privilege, facing the consequences of his actions in the most visceral way possible. The familiar sounds of a prison, the shouting, the clanging of metal, the heavy footsteps of guards, filled his ears. Each noise reminded him that this was his new reality, a world where his badge meant nothing and his past actions had finally caught up with him. The morning sun beat down on the prison yard, casting harsh shadows across the cracked concrete. Mark hunched his shoulders as he walked along the fence line, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. The yard buzzed with activity, some inmates lifting weights, others playing basketball, many just standing in groups, talking in low voices. Mark found an empty bench near the corner of the yard and sat down, keeping his eyes fixed on the ground. The sound of approaching footsteps made his heart rate spike, but he didn't look up. Not until a shadow fell across him. Well, if it isn't Officer Reynolds," a deep voice said, dripping with sarcasm. Mark raised his eyes to see a tall, muscular man standing before him. Behind him stood 4 other inmates, forming a loose semicircle. "The name's Jamal," the man continued, his dark eyes boring into Mark. "Though I'm sure you're used to calling people like me by different names, aren't you?" The other inmates chuckled darkly. Mark's throat went dry. He recognized Jamal as one of the influential figures in Block D, someone the other inmates looked up to. The man carried himself with natural authority, something Mark used to think he possessed himself. "Nothing to say?" Jamal stepped closer, his smile never reaching his eyes. "That's funny. From what I hear, you always had plenty to say when you had that badge." The circle tightened around Mark. One of the inmates gave him a sharp shove from behind, making him stumble forward. "How many of us did you rough up out there?" another inmate demanded. "How many lives did you mess with just because you could?" Mark's fist clenched instinctively, years of police training urging him to respond to the threat. But the rational part of his brain knew better. He was outnumbered, and any resistance would only make things worse. "Remember Tommy?" Jamal asked, his voice growing harder. "The kid you planted evidence on? He spent 2 years in here before the truth came out." Another shove from behind, stronger this time. "Or Maria Rodriguez, the woman you harassed until she was too scared to leave her house?" The taunts continued, each one accompanied by a push or a shove, the circle growing tighter. Mark's breathing became shallow, his palms sweating. He could feel the hatred radiating from the men around him, years of accumulated rage and resentment focused entirely on him. "What's wrong, officer?" Jamal sneered. "Not so tough without your gun and badge, are you?" He stepped right into Mark's personal space, his presence overwhelming. "Now you get to see what it feels like to be on the receiving end?" Mark's back hit the fence. His heart hammered in his chest as the group pressed closer. He could see the violence building in their eyes, the tension in their muscles suggesting imminent action. His own muscles coiled in response, though he knew fighting back would be suicide. Just as Jamal raised his hand, a sharp whistle cut through the air. "Break it up!" a guard shouted from the watchtower. 2 more guards approached quickly from across the yard, hands on their batons. Jamal stepped back, but his eyes never left Mark's face. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying a promise that made Mark's blood run cold. The group dispersed smoothly, melting away into the yard's general population as if nothing had happened. Mark remained against the fence, his legs shaky as the guards passed by. Their faces showed no sympathy. They'd seen what was happening and had waited until the last moment to intervene. The message was clear. He would find no allies here, not even among those who wore the uniform he once did. Mark trudged back to his cell, his body tense from the confrontation in the yard. The metal door clanged shut behind him, the sound echoing through the confined space. His cellmate, Frank Mitchell, sat on the lower bunk, reading a worn paperback novel. Frank glanced up, his weathered face showing neither judgment nor sympathy. "Rough day?" he asked, marking his place in the book with a finger. Mark paced the small cell like a caged animal, his breathing still uneven. "They're going to kill me in here," he muttered, more to himself than to Frank. "Sit down," Frank said quietly, but firmly. "You're making me dizzy with all that pacing." Something in Frank's calm demeanor made Mark comply. He sank onto the edge of his top bunk, his legs dangling over the side. "I saw what happened in the yard," Frank continued, setting his book aside. "You're not in charge here. The sooner you accept that, the better chance you have of making it through this." Mark's jaw clenched. "Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like." "Don't I?" Frank interrupted, his blue eyes sharp but not unkind. "Look, I've been here long enough to see plenty of guys like you come through. Former cops, guards, people who used to have power. The ones who survive are the ones who learn to let go of their pride." "It's not about pride," Mark protested weakly. "No?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "Then what's with that look you get every time a black inmate walks past our cell? The way you tense up, like you're still wearing that badge?" Mark fell silent, caught off guard by Frank's directness. "If you want to survive," Frank continued, his voice steady, "you need to let go of whatever prejudice you're holding on to. Respect goes both ways. These men you're looking down on, they're human beings, just like you. And now you're one of them." The words hit Mark like a physical blow. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the events of the day had left him raw and vulnerable. "I've seen your type before," Frank said, his tone softening slightly. "You thought the badge made you better than everyone else. But look around. Where did that attitude get you?" Mark lay back on his bunk, staring at the gray ceiling. The mattress was thin, the springs digging into his back. The familiar sounds of the prison, distant conversations, the occasional shout, the metallic clicks of doors, filled the silence between them. "How do you do it?" Mark finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you stay so calm?" "Practice," Frank replied simply. "And acceptance. You can't change where you are right now, but you can change how you handle it." The lights dimmed, signaling the approach of lights out. Mark remained motionless on his bunk, Frank's words echoing in his mind. The night stretched ahead of him, promising little rest. As darkness settled over the cell, Mark's thoughts raced. Every creak and distant sound made him flinch. He thought about Jamal's threats, about the hatred in the other inmates' eyes. But he also thought about Frank's words, about respect and prejudice. Sleep refused to come, leaving him alone with the uncomfortable truths he'd spent years avoiding. The following morning, Frank led Mark through the prison's maze-like corridors. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as they approached a set of heavy double doors. "Here we are," Frank said, pushing one door open to reveal the prison library. "My favorite place in this whole building." Mark stepped inside, taking in the rows of well-worn books and the quiet atmosphere. Sunlight filtered through barred windows, casting long shadows across the wooden tables. A few inmates sat reading, their faces peaceful and focused. "It's different here," Mark observed, his voice low. Frank nodded. That's because everyone agrees to leave their problems at the door. In here, we're all just people looking to learn or escape for a while. They walked past shelves of books, Frank occasionally running his fingers along the spines. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," he said, stopping at a quiet corner. "There's a program that meets here twice a week. It's about personal growth, understanding ourselves and others better." Mark's shoulders stiffened. "You mean like group therapy?" "Something like that," Frank replied. "But it's more about community building, learning to see past our differences." Mark started to shake his head, but Frank held up a hand. "Just try one meeting. What have you got to lose?" Later that afternoon, Mark found himself sitting in a circle with 8 other inmates. The group leader, a tall man named Marcus, welcomed everyone with a gentle smile. "Today we're talking about regrets," Marcus announced. "Who'd like to start?" A younger inmate named Carlos raised his hand. "I regret not being there for my kids," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was too busy trying to prove myself on the streets. Now they're growing up without me." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair as others shared similar stories of missed opportunities and painful choices. Each story chipped away at the walls he'd built around himself. Then an older man named James spoke up. "I used to judge people based on how they looked," he admitted. "Thought I knew everything about them just by their appearance. Took me losing everything to realize how wrong I was." Mark's throat tightened. The words hit too close to home. "Would anyone else like to share?" Marcus asked, his eyes meeting Mark's. Mark stared at his hands, noticing how they trembled slightly. He thought about Maya Johnson, about all the times he'd stopped people for no real reason except his own prejudices. The faces in the circle around him suddenly seemed different. Not inmates, not criminals, but people with stories, families, and regrets just like his. He started, then stopped, surprised by the emotion in his voice. "I made assumptions about people, used my badge as an excuse to hurt them. I never thought about the damage I was causing." The room fell silent. Mark expected judgment or anger, but when he looked up, he saw understanding in their eyes. Some nodded, acknowledging his honesty. Marcus leaned forward. "Thank you for sharing that, Mark. Recognition is the first step toward change." As the meeting continued, Mark found himself listening more intently to each person's story. Every shared experience revealed another layer of humanity he'd previously chosen to ignore. The stereotypes he'd carried for so long began to crack and crumble. When the meeting ended, Frank waited by the door. "How do you feel?" he asked as they walked back to their cell. Mark was quiet for a moment, processing the afternoon's experience. "Like I've been wearing blinders my whole life," he finally answered, "and they're starting to come off." At the next group session, Marcus introduced a new topic. "Today, let's talk about what shaped us, our past, our families, the beliefs we grew up with." The familiar tension crept into Mark's shoulders as other inmates shared their stories. He'd attended several meetings now, but speaking about his own past felt different, more exposing. Marcus noticed Mark's discomfort. "Mark, would you like to share with us today?" The room fell silent. Mark's hands clasped together tightly as he looked at the circle of faces around him. Taking a deep breath, he began. "My father was a cop, too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He used to tell me there were 2 kinds of people in the world, us and them. The good guys and the bad guys." Mark paused, swallowing hard. He'd come home from his shifts and talk about the thugs he'd arrested, always describing them the same way, always using the same words. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mark continued. "I remember sitting at our kitchen table, listening to him. I was just a kid, but those words, those ideas, they got inside my head. when I became a cop myself, it felt natural to see the world the way he did, to judge people before I knew them. His voice cracked slightly. I never questioned it, never thought about how wrong it was until... He gestured at his prison uniform. Until I ended up here. Jamal, who had been listening intently from across the circle, leaned forward. Let me tell you what it's like from the other side, he said, his voice calm but firm. I was first stopped by police when I was 12. 12 years old, walking home from the corner store with a candy bar. Mark looked up, meeting Jamal's eyes for the first time. The officer said I fit a description, Jamal continued. That became a regular part of my life, being stopped, questioned, treated like a criminal. By the time I was 16, I'd been wrongfully detained 3 times. Once, they held me for hours because I looked suspicious walking in my own neighborhood. Other inmates nodded, murmuring in recognition of similar experiences. You want to know what that does to a person? Jamal asked, not unkindly. It makes you angry. It makes you afraid. It makes you teach your kids how to act around police so they don't get hurt. My son was 4 when I had to explain to him why he couldn't play with toy guns like his white friends did. Mark felt something shift inside him as he listened. The stories he'd grown up hearing from his father began to crack and fall away, replaced by these raw, honest accounts of pain and injustice. The system isn't broken, Jamal said, looking around the circle. It was built this way. And people like you, Mark, no offense, were taught not to see it. No offense taken, Mark replied quietly. I'm starting to see it now. Marcus nodded encouragingly. That's what these sessions are about. Seeing each other's truth, understanding perspectives different from our own. The conversation continued, with other inmates sharing their experiences of profiling, discrimination, and systemic barriers. Mark listened, really listened, feeling the weight of his former actions pressing against his conscience. Each story helped him understand the depth of harm caused by the prejudices he'd carried for so long. Later that evening, as inmates filtered back to their cells, Jamal caught up with Mark in the dimly lit corridor. The usual hostility in his eyes had softened slightly, replaced by something closer to curiosity. Didn't think you'd have the guts to speak up, Jamal admitted, his voice low enough that only Mark could hear. He reached into his prison-issued jacket and pulled out a worn paperback book. The spine was creased from multiple readings, and the pages had yellowed with age. Mark hesitated before accepting the offering, noting how the corners were dog-eared and some passages were underlined in faint pencil marks. Educate yourself, Jamal said simply, then turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Back in his cell, Mark settled onto his thin mattress and examined the book. It was a comprehensive history of the civil rights movement, filled with stories he'd never learned in school. Frank glanced over from the top bunk, but said nothing, giving Mark space to process. As the prison settled into its nighttime routine, Mark began to read. The overhead lights were harsh, but he barely noticed as he immersed himself in accounts of sit-ins, freedom rides, and peaceful protests met with violence. His fingers traced over photographs of young activists facing down fire hoses and police dogs. The stories hit differently now. Each page revealed struggles he'd never truly understood before. He read about mothers teaching their children how to respond to police harassment, families denied housing and opportunities, communities torn apart by systemic injustice. These weren't just historical events. They were personal testimonies of survival and resistance. Mark paused on a passage about police brutality in the 1960s. The descriptions were uncomfortably familiar. He recognized tactics he'd used himself, justifications he'd made. His throat tightened as he realized how little had changed in all these years. One particular story caught his attention. A young boy arrested for simply walking through a white neighborhood. The details were similar to cases Mark had handled as an officer, incidents he dismissed as routine stops. But now, seeing it from this perspective, he felt the weight of generations of fear and trauma. The words on the pages seemed to pulse with life, challenging everything he'd been taught to believe. Each chapter stripped away another layer of his former certainty, revealing the complex reality he'd refused to see for so long. As Lights Out approached, Mark carefully marked his place in the book. His mind was buzzing with new understanding, uncomfortable but necessary truths settling into his consciousness. He thought about his father's kitchen table lectures, about his own years of enforcing a system he'd never questioned. The book rested heavily in his hands, more than just paper and ink. It was a bridge to understanding, a key to unlocking perspectives he'd spent a lifetime ignoring. Over the next few weeks, Mark found himself returning to Jamal's book repeatedly, each reading revealing new layers of understanding. During meals in the crowded cafeteria, he observed the subtle ways guards treated inmates differently based on their race, behaviors he'd once participated in without a second thought. One morning, while helping Frank organize books in the prison library, Mark's hands trembled as he shelved a volume about police reform. "I never wanted to see it before," he said quietly. "All the times I pulled people over for no real reason. The way I spoke to them, how I assumed the worst." Frank paused his work, giving Mark a thoughtful look. "Recognizing it is the first step. What matters now is what you do with that knowledge." The words stuck with Mark as he went about his daily routine. During group therapy sessions, he began sharing more openly about his past actions, not as justifications, but as acknowledgments of harm done. The other inmates' responses surprised him. While some remained understandably wary, others appreciated his honesty. Mark started volunteering for additional programs within the prison. He joined the literacy initiative, helping inmates improve their reading skills. During these sessions, he heard stories of how limited education and systemic barriers had impacted their lives. Each story added another crack to his former worldview. In the prison yard, he noticed a young inmate sitting alone, clearly struggling to adjust to prison life. Instead of walking past as he once would have, Mark approached carefully. "The first few months are the hardest," he offered. The young man, Marcus, looked up skeptically, but eventually opened up about his fears and frustrations. During a community meeting, Mark raised his hand to speak. The room fell silent. He rarely contributed to these discussions. "I've been thinking about ways to address racial bias in the criminal justice system," he began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Maybe we could start a discussion group, share experiences and ideas for change?" Jamal, sitting across the room, studied Mark intently. After the meeting, he approached. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he asked. Mark nodded, and Jamal considered for a moment before saying, "I might know some guys who'd be interested in joining that discussion group." With the warden's approval, Mark and Jamal began co-facilitating weekly conversations about justice reform. The sessions often became heated, but Mark learned to listen without becoming defensive. He took notes, documenting patterns of discrimination and brainstorming potential solutions with the group. One afternoon, while mopping the corridor floors, Mark overheard a new guard making disparaging remarks about an inmate. His old self would have laughed along or stayed silent. Instead, he respectfully but firmly spoke up, pointing out the harmful impact of such comments. The guard was taken aback, but something in Mark's calm demeanor made him listen. In his cell at night, Mark often reflected on Maya Johnson and countless others he'd mistreated. He began keeping a journal, recording his realizations and regrets, but also his hopes for making meaningful changes. The words flowed easier now, free from the defensive anger that had once defined him. Mark sat at a worn wooden desk in the prison's education center, surrounded by the soft murmur of students working through practice problems. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he reviewed a math worksheet with Deshawn, a 19-year-old inmate whose determined expression reminded him so much of his own son, Michael. "So if x equals 7, Mark explained patiently, what would be the next step?" He watched as Deshawn's brow furrowed in concentration. "I multiply both sides by 2? Deshawn asked hesitantly, his pencil hovering over the paper. "That's exactly right," Mark smiled, feeling a surge of pride as Deshawn's face lit up. "You're getting better at this every day." The education program had started as just another way to pass time, but Mark found himself looking forward to these sessions more than anything else. Many of the students struggled with basic reading and math skills, gaps in their education that society had never bothered to fill. During one session, Deshawn confided in Mark about his childhood. "Never had nobody to help me with homework," he said quietly, erasing a mistake on his paper. "My mama worked 2 jobs and school just wasn't, you know?" Mark nodded, his throat tight. He thought about all the times he'd judged people without understanding their stories, the countless times he'd made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice. The other inmates in the program began to open up to him, too. Jerome shared his dream of opening a barbershop once he got out. Marcus wanted to learn enough math to help his daughter with her homework during visits. Their trust in him felt like a precious gift, one he knew he hadn't earned, but desperately wanted to deserve. One afternoon, while helping Deshawn prepare for a practice test, Mark noticed him struggling to read a word problem. "Take your time," he encouraged. "Break it down word by word." "Man, I feel stupid sometimes," Deshawn admitted, pushing the paper away in frustration. "Like maybe I'm too old to learn this stuff now." "Hey," Mark said firmly, "you're one of the hardest working students I've ever seen. Age doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here, trying. That takes real courage." Deshawn looked at him for a long moment, then pulled the paper back. "All right, let me try again." As weeks passed, Mark found himself sharing stories about his own son during their study sessions. He showed Deshawn a worn photo he kept in his pocket, Michael at his high school graduation, grinning proudly in his cap and gown. "He looks happy," Deshawn observed, carefully handing the photo back. "Yeah," Mark replied softly. "I hope he still is. We haven't spoken since—" He trailed off, but Deshawn nodded in understanding. The education program became more than just teaching. It became a place where barriers broke down, where labels like officer and inmate mattered less than the shared goal of learning and growth. Mark realized that for the first time in his career, he was truly serving others rather than just wielding authority over them. During group study sessions, he watched as inmates helped each other, explaining concepts they understood to those who were struggling. The sense of community surprised him. It was nothing like the harsh, every-man-for-himself environment he'd expected when he first arrived. "You're different from what I thought cops would be like," Deshawn told him one day as they packed up their books. "You actually listen to us, you know?" Mark felt the weight of those words. "I'm learning too," he replied honestly. "I should have started a lot sooner." The idea for the charity drive came to Mark one evening in the library as he watched an inmate struggling to read from a tattered paperback with missing pages. He approached Jamal the next day during yard time, nervous but determined. "I've been thinking," Mark said, fidgeting with his hands. "These kids in poor neighborhoods, they need books, supplies, things we take for granted." Jamal studied him for a long moment. "And what made you suddenly care about poor neighborhoods?" Teaching here, it's opened my eyes, Mark admitted. Every student I work with, I keep thinking about what might have been different if they'd had more support early on. To Mark's surprise, Jamal nodded slowly. Yeah, I feel you. What you got in mind? They spent the next hour sketching out plans. Word spread quickly through the prison grapevine, and soon inmates were approaching them with ideas. Some offered to donate their commissary money. Others volunteered to help organize and sort donations. Never thought I'd see the day, Frank commented one afternoon, watching Mark and Jamal coordinate with other inmates in the common area. A former cop and the guys he used to lock up working together. Mark looked up from the donation list they were compiling. Neither did I, he said quietly. I was so wrong about everything. The prison administration approved their initiative after some convincing. Donation boxes appeared in the visitation area, and families began bringing books and school supplies. Inmates with artistic talent created posters to promote the drive, while others wrote letters to local schools identifying their needs. During one sorting session, Mark found himself working alongside Torres, an inmate he'd arrested years ago. Instead of hostility, they sorted books together in comfortable silence. My kid sister, Torres said suddenly, holding up a math workbook. She's real smart, you know, but her school, they ain't got proper supplies. Maybe this'll help someone like her. Mark nodded, understanding deepening in his chest. Every day brought new revelations, new perspectives he'd been blind to before. The men he'd once seen as just criminals were fathers, brothers, sons, people who cared about their communities despite their mistakes. Jamal proved to be an exceptional organizer, using his natural leadership abilities to coordinate different aspects of the drive. He assigned tasks based on each person's strengths, creating an efficient system that impressed even the guards. You know what's funny? Jamal said one day as they sorted through a new batch of donations. People think prison is just punishment. But look at what we're doing here. We're making something good happen from behind these walls. Frank observed their progress from his usual spot in the library corner, a gentle smile playing on his lips. He'd watched Mark's transformation from the beginning, from the angry, defensive ex-cop to someone who genuinely cared about making amends. The charity drive brought an unexpected sense of purpose to the prison community. Men who rarely spoke to each other found common ground in their desire to help. Even those who couldn't contribute materially offered encouragement and support. It's like we're human again, one inmate remarked during a sorting session, not just numbers in the system. Mark felt the truth of those words deeply. Each box of donations represented more than just supplies. It represented hope, connection, and the possibility of change. He thought about Maya, about his own abuse of power, and about how different things might have been if he'd understood sooner what he was learning now. The spring afternoon started like any other in the prison yard. Inmates clustered in their usual groups, some playing basketball, while others walked the perimeter or sat at metal tables. Mark was helping Deshaun with his algebra homework, using a stick to draw equations in the dirt. So, if x equals 7, Deshaun said, his forehead wrinkled in concentration, then the answer is... A sudden commotion erupted near the basketball court. Two rival gang members had collided during a game, and within seconds, the situation escalated. Shouts filled the air as more inmates joined the fray, throwing punches and shoving each other. Mark's heart jumped when he saw Deshaun get caught in the surge of bodies. The young man had simply been walking past the court when the fight broke out, and now he was trapped between the warring groups. Without thinking, Mark sprinted toward the chaos. His former police training kicked in as he assessed the situation. Deshaun had dropped to the ground, trying to protect himself as feet stumbled around him. "Hold on, Deshaun," Mark called out. He pushed through the crowd, taking an elbow to the face in the process. Blood trickled from his nose, but he didn't stop. Reaching Deshawn, Mark created a protective barrier with his body, shielding the younger man from the violence. "Stay low," Mark instructed, helping Deshawn crawl away from the center of the fight. A fist glanced off Mark's shoulder, and someone's knee caught him in the ribs. He gritted his teeth through the pain, focused only on getting Deshawn to safety. Guards rushed in with batons and pepper spray, ordering everyone to the ground. Mark kept his body curved over Deshawn until the area was secured. As the dust settled, medical staff arrived to treat the injured. "You okay?" Mark asked Deshawn, helping him sit up. Deshawn nodded, his eyes wide. "Yeah, thanks to you. You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Mark replied simply. Later that afternoon, a guard escorted Mark to the warden's office. Warden Phillips, a stern woman with graying hair, studied him from behind her desk. "Officer Martinez gave me a full report of what happened in the yard," she said. "You put yourself at considerable risk to help another inmate." Mark shifted in his chair. "Deshawn's a good kid. He's working hard to get his GED. I couldn't let him get hurt." The warden's expression softened slightly. "I've been watching your progress, Reynolds. The education program, the charity drive, the way you've been helping others. It's a far cry from the man who arrived here." "Prison has taught me more than I ever learned with a badge," Mark admitted. "I see people now, not just criminals or stereotypes." "That's exactly the kind of transformation we hope for," Warden Phillips said, "though few actually achieve it. Your actions today demonstrate genuine change, not just words." She pulled out a form from her desk drawer. "I'm recommending you for additional privileges based on your positive influence on the prison community. Keep up the good work, Reynolds." Mark returned to his cell block that evening, his ribs sore, but his spirit lifted. As he passed other inmates, he noticed a shift in how they looked at him, with respect rather than suspicion or hatred. Deshawn's friend group even saved him a seat at dinner. The incident in the yard had done more than just protect one young man. It had shown everyone that Mark's change was real. He wasn't acting out of self-interest or trying to earn early release. He had put himself in harm's way because he genuinely cared. Mark sat in the small parole hearing room, his hands folded on the table before him. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as 3 board members reviewed his file. His heart pounded, but he kept his expression calm, remembering Frank's advice from that morning. "Just be honest," Frank had told him. "They'll see the truth in your words." The lead board member, Mrs. Rodriguez, adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Reynolds, your record shows remarkable improvement during your incarceration. You've participated in numerous rehabilitation programs and have become instrumental in the prison's education initiatives." "Yes, ma'am," Mark replied. "Being here has opened my eyes to many things I was blind to before." The door opened and Jamal entered. Mark hadn't expected to see him here. Jamal stood tall, his presence commanding respect. "I never thought I'd speak up for a former cop," Jamal began, "especially one with Reynolds' history. But this man isn't the same person who came here 2 years ago." He described how Mark had helped organize the book drive, mentioning specific instances where Mark had shown genuine concern for others. "He's learned what it means to be on the other side of power, and it's changed him." Deshawn came in next, clutching his newly earned GED certificate. "Mr. Reynolds taught me more than just math," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "He showed me that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us. When that fight broke out in the yard, he protected me without thinking about himself." The testimony that surprised Mark most came from Frank, who spoke about their daily conversations and Mark's gradual transformation. "I've seen many men claim to change in prison," Frank said. "Most are just playing the game. But Mark's different. He's done the hard work of confronting his prejudices and making genuine amends." Several other inmates followed, each sharing stories of how Mark had impacted their lives. One spoke about how Mark had helped him write letters to his children. Another described how Mark's conflict resolution skills had prevented several potentially violent situations. Mrs. Rodriguez studied Mark carefully. "Mr. Reynolds, what would you say to those you wronged in the past, if they were here today?" Mark took a deep breath. "I'd say I'm sorry, but I know words aren't enough. My actions as a police officer came from a place of fear and prejudice I didn't even recognize. Being here has taught me to see people as individuals, each with their own story. I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I can dedicate myself to being part of the solution instead of the problem." The board members conferred quietly among themselves. Mark waited, aware of the supportive presence of his fellow inmates behind him. He realized that regardless of the outcome, he had already received something invaluable, the genuine respect and friendship of men he once would have dismissed without a second thought. "The depth of support you've received from your fellow inmates is unprecedented in my experience," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Their testimonies speak to significant personal growth and positive influence within the prison community." The morning sun cast long shadows across the prison parking lot as Mark stepped through the heavy metal gates for the last time. His few possessions were contained in a small cardboard box, some books, letters, and the worn civil rights text Jamal had given him. The weight of freedom felt both liberating and daunting. Frank Mitchell stood waiting, dressed in casual clothes that looked strange after seeing him in prison uniforms for so long. His familiar calm smile put Mark at ease. "Welcome to the outside," Frank said, pulling Mark into a brief hug. "Thanks for being here," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't expecting anyone." Frank gestured toward his modest sedan. "First stop is the halfway house. I've already spoken with them. They've got a bed ready for you." As they drove through the city streets, Mark absorbed the sights and sounds of freedom. Everything looked different now, as if he was seeing the world through new eyes. "Now the real work begins," Frank said, glancing at his former cellmate. "Prison might change a man, but staying changed out here, that's the challenge." Mark nodded, understanding the weight of Frank's words. "I've been thinking about what to do first," he said. "I need to make things right, starting with Judge Johnson and Maya." "You sure that's wise?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already knew Mark's answer. "I heard he volunteers at the Riverside Community Center," Mark explained. "I thought I'd start there, not to ambush him, just to show him I'm different now, that what happened in prison wasn't just an act." Frank pulled into the parking lot of the halfway house, a plain brick building that would be Mark's home for the next few months. "Just remember," he said, turning to face Mark, "redemption isn't about grand gestures. It's about the small choices we make every day." Mark gathered his box of belongings, looking at the community center's address he'd written down. "I know," he said, "but I need to try. Those 2 years inside taught me that avoiding hard conversations only makes things worse." Frank helped him carry his things inside, where they completed the check-in process. After getting settled in his small room, Mark stood at the window, watching the city life below. The community center was just a few blocks away. His stomach churned with nervousness, but he felt certain about his decision. "I'll give you a ride," Frank offered, reading Mark's expression. "But remember, if he's not ready to see you, you need to respect that." Mark agreed, knowing that making amends couldn't be forced. It had to be earned one step at a time. As they headed toward the community center, he silently rehearsed what he might say to Judge Johnson, understanding that this was just the beginning of a much longer journey. Mark's footsteps echoed through the community center's entrance hall as he made his way inside, his heart pounding against his ribs. The familiar scent of coffee and cleaning supplies filled the air, mingling with the sounds of distant chatter and shuffling papers. Frank had dropped him off with a reassuring pat on the shoulder, leaving Mark to face this moment alone. Through the large double doors of the main activity room, he spotted Judge Johnson immediately. The judge stood near a folding table, directing volunteers who were arranging donation boxes and sorting through clothing items. He looked exactly as Mark remembered him from the courtroom, though his demeanor was more relaxed in this setting, a gentle smile playing across his face as he worked with the community members. Mark's throat went dry. His hands felt clammy, and he wiped them against his pants before taking a tentative step forward. 2 years of rehabilitation and self-reflection had led to this moment, yet nothing could fully prepare him for it. He watched as Judge Johnson checked items off a clipboard, speaking warmly to an elderly volunteer beside him. Taking a deep breath, Mark crossed the room. Several volunteers glanced his way, but he kept his focus on the judge. When he was just a few feet away, Judge Johnson looked up, his expression shifting as recognition dawned in his eyes. "Judge Johnson," Mark began, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite the shame that threatened to overwhelm him. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to apologize to you and your daughter for all the pain I've caused." The judge's face remained neutral as he studied Mark, taking in the changes that prison had wrought. Gone was the arrogant stance and contemptuous glare that had characterized the former officer. Instead, Mark stood with his shoulders slightly hunched, his eyes reflecting a hard-won humility. His prison-issued clothes had been replaced with simple civilian attire, but the real transformation was evident in his demeanor. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ambient sounds of the charity event continuing around them. Mark felt the weight of each passing second, but he held his ground, accepting that whatever response came, he would face it with the dignity he had learned during his incarceration. Judge Johnson gestured toward a quiet corner of the room where 2 chairs sat near a window. "Let's talk," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Mark followed him, each step feeling weighted with the significance of the moment. They settled into the chairs, sunlight streaming through the window and casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The bustling activity of the volunteers provided a gentle backdrop to their conversation. "I've heard about your work in prison," Judge Johnson began, folding his hands in his lap. "The education program, the charity drive. Frank Mitchell keeps in touch." Mark nodded, surprised that Frank had maintained contact with the judge. "Frank helped me see things differently," he admitted. "So did others, Jamal, Deshawn. They showed me kindness I didn't deserve." "And why didn't you deserve it?" the judge prompted, leaning forward slightly. Mark's eyes grew damp as he considered the question. "Because I never showed them any. I judge people based on nothing but prejudice. I abused my power. What I did to your daughter—" He paused, swallowing hard. "There's no excuse." Judge Johnson watched him carefully. "No, there isn't," he agreed. "But accountability isn't just about acknowledging wrong. It's about doing the work to become better." "I'm trying," Mark said softly. "Every day I try to remember the lessons I learned inside. How wrong I was about everything. About people." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Change isn't easy," he observed. "Many people never attempt it, even when they know they should. It takes courage to face yourself honestly." Mark wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't know if I can ever make up for the harm I've caused." "Forgiveness isn't mine alone to give," Judge Johnson replied, his voice gentle but firm. "Maya, your ex-wife Emily, the countless others affected by your actions, they'll each have their own journey with forgiveness. But I believe people can change if they're willing to put in the work. He gestured around the community center. "We always need volunteers here. People who understand the importance of giving back, of building bridges instead of walls. If you're serious about continuing your growth, this could be a good place to start." Mark looked around the room, taking in the diverse group of volunteers working together. It was a far cry from the prejudiced worldview he'd once held. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "If people would be willing to give me a chance." "That's up to you," Judge Johnson replied. "Show them the same person I'm seeing now, someone who's learned from their mistakes and wants to do better. Actions speak louder than words, Officer Reynolds. They always have." The use of his former title made Mark flinch slightly, but he understood its purpose. It was a reminder of who he had been and the responsibility he carried to be someone different now. Over the following weeks, Mark became a regular presence at the community center. He arrived early each morning, helping to set up for the day's activities, his movements careful and deliberate as he arranged chairs and prepared materials for the youth programs. The teens who attended the center were initially wary of him. They'd shuffle past, casting suspicious glances his way, especially when they learned he was a former police officer. But Mark's honesty about his past slowly began to break down those barriers. "I made terrible choices," he told a group of teenagers during one session. "I let prejudice poison my mind and abuse my authority." His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but he maintained eye contact with his young audience. "I hurt people who didn't deserve it, and I have to live with that every day." Among the teens was Marcus, a 15-year-old who reminded Mark of himself at that age, angry, defensive, and heading down a dangerous path. After one particularly heated group discussion, Marcus stayed behind. "How'd you know you needed to change?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark considered the question carefully. "It took losing everything, my freedom, my dignity, my power. But mostly it took meeting people who showed me kindness even when I didn't deserve it. They helped me see how wrong I'd been." His story resonated with many of the youth, particularly those struggling with anger and authority issues. He worked with them one-on-one, sharing the harsh lessons he'd learned about consequences and the importance of treating others with respect. From her office window, Maya occasionally observed these interactions. She watched as Mark sat with the teens, his body language open and vulnerable, so different from the intimidating officer who had harassed her that day at the boutique. She noticed how he listened more than he spoke, how he never tried to force his views on others. During one afternoon session, Maya overheard Mark speaking to a group about accountability. "It's not enough to say sorry," he explained, unaware of her presence near the doorway. "You have to show it through your actions every single day. And even then, you have to accept that some people may never forgive you, and that's their right." The sincerity in his voice made Maya pause. She watched as he worked with a young girl who was struggling with math homework, his patience evident in his gentle encouragement. It was hard to reconcile this version of Mark with the man who had treated her so cruelly. As the weeks passed, Mark expanded his involvement, organizing workshops on conflict resolution and creating a mentorship program that paired troubled teens with positive role models from the community. He drew on his prison experiences, bringing in former inmates who had successfully rebuilt their lives to share their stories. Maya noticed how the teens responded to these real-life examples of transformation. She saw how Mark's vulnerability in sharing his own failures made it easier for them to open up about their struggles. Though she wasn't ready to interact with him directly, she couldn't deny the positive impact he was having on the community center's youth program. The changes in Mark were evident to everyone who knew his story. Gone was the arrogant swagger of the former police officer. Instead, he moved through the world with humility and purpose, his focus entirely on giving back to the community he had once harmed. The community center's main hall buzzed with anticipation as people filled the rows of chairs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting warm patches across the wooden floor. Mark stood at the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. 10 years ago, he began, his voice steady despite his nerves, I wouldn't have believed I'd be standing here today. I was a different person then, someone filled with prejudice and anger. The audience listened intently as Mark shared his story. He described his transformation in prison, the mentors who guided him, and the hard lessons he learned along the way. His voice cracked when he spoke about the people he'd hurt. Every day I work to be better than I was yesterday, he continued. The greatest gift I've received is the opportunity to make amends, to help others avoid the mistakes I made. It's not about erasing the past. It's about creating a better future. As Mark spoke about the youth programs at the center, several teenagers in the audience nodded in recognition. He acknowledged them with a gentle smile, remembering their individual struggles and victories. Second chances aren't guaranteed, he said, gripping the edges of the podium. They're precious opportunities that come with responsibility. Each day I'm grateful for the people who believed change was possible, even when I didn't believe it myself. When Mark finished speaking, the applause started softly, then grew stronger. People rose to their feet, their appreciation genuine and heartfelt. He stepped away from the podium, humbled by the response. As the crowd began to disperse, Maya made her way toward him. Her steps were purposeful but unhurried. Mark noticed her approach and stood very still, respecting whatever choice she might make. "Thank you for what you're doing," she said softly, meeting his eyes. Mark nodded appreciatively, understanding the weight of her words. This simple exchange carried years of history, pain, and gradual healing. From across the room, Judge Johnson observed the interaction. His face softened as he watched this moment of reconciliation. The tension he'd carried for so long began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of peace. Mark stood there, surrounded by community members, people he had once viewed with suspicion and prejudice. Now they worked together, shared meals together, and supported each other's growth. The distance between us and them had disappeared, replaced by a shared vision of what their community could become. If you enjoyed the story of Mark, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.